In the ancient world, Christianity was so weird. It was so foreign, so strange to people. And you're urging contemporary Christians to embrace the weirdness.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
Well, weirdness is an essential key to Christianity. I should have mentioned that as one of the keys to Christian expansion. Christian belief is a paradox.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we put aside talk of culture war or all the stuff we seem to disagree about and talk about the human longings and experiences we all share that make up the mystery of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. Greg Sheridan is the foreign editor at the Australian newspaper. He's been in that role since 1992, and he is one of Australia's leading national security and foreign affairs analysts, and has interviewed prime ministers and presidents all over the world. He also writes about Christianity and culture, and his last 3 books have been on that subject. The latest in a trilogy of books on Christianity is just out, so we thought it would be good to have Greg back into the CPX studio to talk about it. The latest book is essentially about the incredible way Christianity was born and grew in the ancient world, and what we can learn from that period for life today. So the reader is introduced to the early Christians in the first half of the book, and in the second half we hear from contemporary Christians and the way that their faith is impacting their lives and the lives of the people around them. This edition is titled How Christians Can Succeed Today. And I was wondering about that title and thought it important first up to ask Greg what he means by succeed. Here's Greg.
One of the most challenging things you ever do in writing books, and you must have found this too, Simon, is the title.
Yeah, and it's possibly the hardest part sometimes.
Possibly the hardest thing. You go back and forth on the title. I used to propose very poetic, clever, elusive titles,
yes.
And the publisher would say, that's a great title for after you've read the book. It's no use to you before you've read the book, you know. I was going to call one book The Ragged Edge of Christianity or something, and he said, yeah, that's a lovely line, but
no one knows what it means.
Nobody will have any idea what it means. So this is meant to tell people what this book is. And the book came from a suggestion from a friend of yours and a friend of mine, John Dixon, who said, after your 2 previous Christian books, Christians now would find it helpful to get some positive suggestions. So succeed, I guess, means in its broadest sense. So obviously how they succeed in being Christ-like, leading good lives, but also how do they succeed in interesting the culture and spreading the message, fulfilling the Great Commission, going out and preaching the word and having an effect on the culture. Christians want to have an effect on the culture, and the early Christians did, even though they were aware of the modesty of their circumstances and all the rest of it.
And so one of my slight hesitations about the title was that people might think this is only for Christian people, whereas it's absolutely broader than that, I think, Greg.
You're absolutely right, Simon. That is an ambiguity in the title. But
yeah.
I tell you what, you should see the 98 titles we rejected. They were much worse.
We'll get to
But you're absolutely right. I aim my books at anyone who's interested.
Yeah.
The publisher always asks you, who do you think is going to read the book? And I can tell them that, but I want it to be a general conversation.
Yes.
And I've been so lucky that quite a number of conscientious atheist broadcasters, you know, like Richard Glover famously, have been interested to talk about the book.
Yeah.
And some atheist groups, there was an atheist philanthropic group, which had me for a 40-minute or hour-long Zoom, and it was a wonderful dialogue. They weren't denouncing belief, and I certainly wasn't denouncing them. But yeah, so I'm non-denominational within Christianity. I hope people of other faiths might find the book interesting, and people of no faith, because the early Christians did transform Western civilization. So that's interesting historically.
What was the thing that most stood out to you about the early Christians as they faced huge opposition in the Roman Empire?
Well, Simon, it was great fun to spend this time with the early Christians. There are a lot of writings by and about early Christians, so you can really get in amongst them, and a lot of them were very familiar to me in the sort of personality types they were. And, this will sound strange, but the first chapter tries to compare their cultural moment to our cultural moment.
Yes.
Are we a little neo-pagan? What does that mean? And so on. But the single thing that stood out most of all, I'm not saying it's the best thing about them or the cause to their success or anything, was the absolute familiarity. I felt like I was talking to friends of mine and members of my extended family. They're all the same problems. So-and-so is a lazy bugger. He won't do any work. Do we have to pay him out of our charitable earnings? And we've got to raise some money for the church in Jerusalem. And so-and-so's got a bad temper and we want to send a mission, but we've got to be a bit careful about it. Let's not get into trouble with the law unless we have to, and so on. And really, I'm deeply of the view, dogmatically, that the essence of humanity doesn't change. And the early Christians were just like my friends, and I so much enjoyed spending time with them. Probably my favourite character of all was Augustine, but they're all terrific fun to be with.
And you're thinking largely of the biblical material, but then all this sort of extra biblical material writing about the history of this time.
Absolutely, and all the letters they wrote to each other. So I do use the Acts of the Apostles a bit, and I go back to the Gospels and so on. But the people I'm really interested in are the people after Jesus is gone. So if Jesus is standing next to you physically, even a coward like me might seem brave for a minute. But when he's gone, then they're moderns. They're like us. They haven't shook his hand and, had breakfast with him by the side of the Galilee and so forth. So I was really interested in Christians from after Jesus ascends to heaven, right up to about Augustine. I finished with Augustine. Now, it's not a comprehensive history. That part of the book is only a little under 200 pages. And I wanted to operate as far as I could from primary sources. Now, I'm not a scholar of biblical languages, so this is not a philological exploration of ancient Greek or anything, but there are fabulous translations. So the letters of Clement and Irenaeus, the writings of Tertullian and Origen, the testimony many of them gave before death, when they were in prison, sentenced to execution, but had a few weeks hanging around, and they either wrote or spoke about how they felt. So there's this extraordinary case of the two women, Felicity and Perpetua, who are executed, and they have, like Paul, complete psychological self-possession in the face of death, and it's their relationship with Christ which gives that. And then, of course, Augustine wrote 5 million words. Not quite as much as a lifer at News Corp, but quite a lot.
Getting close.
So there's just so much primary source material. And I think these people have been tremendously neglected, even by Christians. So the culture neglects early Christianity, and it even neglects the story of Jesus and so on. But every now and again, you get The Chosen or The Passion of the Christ or something. But no one makes a movie about Polycarp or Irenaeus or Clement of Rome. Now, Clement, he was a bit of a dullard compared to the others, but you like him too because, the world has got plenty of room for dullards.
Well, that you mentioned the two women who were executed. It's a very moving story, isn't it? And brilliant drama. And as you say, the determination to be true to their faith right to that gruesome end. And lots of these examples weren't there. And you write very movingly about that. There's something very powerful in that testimony.
Absolutely. So one theme of the book and one theme of the early Christians is that there were really more women than men in the early Christian movement. The evidence for that is kind of overwhelming.
Yeah.
And the attitude to women was completely revolutionary for the ancient world. I mean, Jesus himself in the Gospels tends to upend social hierarchies, and the early Christians did that as well. In a world completely based on hierarchy, slaves, women, foreigners, everybody had a divine human dignity because of their relationship to God. But the case of Perpetua and Felicity, they were not even fully confirmed Christians when they were arrested for attending what we might call catechetical classes in order to become Christians. There was a rule against conversion. So persecution was spasmodic, it wasn't constant, but there was a spasm of persecution. There was a rule against conversion, and they were offered liberty in their lives if they would renounce the Christian faith, which they were just on the point of embracing, and neither of them did. And Felicity in particular either wrote or dictated to somebody a lot of her reflections. Her father begs her to change, and she defies her father. So here's a social revolution in Rome itself, a daughter defying her father. And she even has mystical moments of joy and happiness heading towards her fate, a gruesome, terrible fate of being executed. But there's a serenity about it all. So that might be the earliest Latin writing we have by a woman of any kind. And that example, it became famous all through the Roman Empire. Christians promoted that and promoted her words and so on all through the empire. And it's extraordinary. And her companion wanted to be executed with her, who was a slave. So Felicity was noble born, Perpetua was a slave.
It's kind of unthinkable, isn't it, in the ancient world, that they'd have that bond.
Absolutely. And Perpetua was pregnant, and the Romans wouldn't execute a pregnant woman, not out of any consideration of humanity, but because the child belonged to some man.
An ownership thing.
Yeah, so it was a property right thing. So she was happy that she was able to give birth and be executed with her friend.
Now, one of the motivations for writing this, as you recognise, I guess, a polycrisis in Western culture, the huge problems with polarisation, crisis of meaning, deaths of despair, a loneliness epidemic, and your sense that Christianity has something vital to say about all of this. You think Christianity offers some sort of solution to this, don't you?
Well, I do, Simon. So I'm a believing Christian, and I write as a believing Christian. But at the same time, I'm a mainstream secular journalist. So it's a little bit of a double personality you have, But I don't think Christians need to hide their beliefs in any way. In fact, one of the purposes of writing these books is to encourage all Christians, where it's proper and appropriate and reasonable, to own their faith publicly. Because if you do that, you provide solidarity for other Christians, and it might just be that through your efforts, somebody hears about the truth for the first time. Somebody was telling me about a group of businessmen in a restaurant who paused to say grace before their meal. Someone came up to ask them what they were doing, and that person eventually became a Christian. But does Christianity have a solution for our social problems? I think it does. I'm not a political Christian. I don't think you have to be centre right or centre left or anything else in order to be a Christian. You can be a good Christian, have all kinds. I mean, you can't be a Christian and be a racist or in favour of murder or something, but you can have all kinds of different policy positions.
No, I think you make that point really well in the book. Yeah.
Thanks. And the society is suffering a crisis. I mean, the chief cause of death of Australians of all kinds from 18 to 44 is suicide. That's a shocking thing. In this rich, blessed, sunlit, happy country, somehow or other, culturally, we're conveying to young people the message that life is so bleak that despair is the right alternative. Well, Christianity certainly offers something better than despair. Young people in particular, I think, are full of idealism and heroism, and they're also typically searching for meaning and purpose. Every pleasure is available to them on these terrible iPhones which rule all of our lives, even me, a technophobe like me. You ask my wife, I can't, I'm erudite onto the flaming thing. But it's destructive, and a lot of people recognise that they've been led down a dry gulch, and Christianity and Christ offer the way to meaning and fulfilment.
Now, a bunch of people are noticing and writing about a possible return to faith for numbers of people in the West, also some influential people. And you noted at one point that, like the 1920s and 30s, this is a time of intense political and social dislocation, if you like. And you note that this was a time when people like C.S. Lewis, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, Thomas Merton all became Christians. Do you actually think that we're seeing anything like a return to faith? Because a lot of your book is pointing out how far people are in the West from faith.
Well, that's a $64 million question, Simon, and I'm going to do something which newspaper columnists never should do. I'm going to hedge. And, you pay your $5 for the paper. You expect the columnists to make a fool of themselves by having a clear opinion, which can be right or wrong. But a couple of things to distinguish here. So within the West, by which I mean Central and Western Europe, North America, Australia and New Zealand, Christianity has been in tremendous decline for decades and perhaps for a couple of hundred years. Really, there's been a cultural project of disenchantment. God doesn't exist. The Bible is all lies. Human beings have no more significance than any other biological life form. So it's, how did we lose belief? Slowly, and then suddenly. And I've been writing about this for 15 years in a considered way because it dawned on me that this was big trouble our culture was getting into, and circumstance had given me a microphone and so on, so I thought I'd better answer the biggest question. But just in the last couple of years, there's been an astonishing turnaround amongst young people, also amongst intellectuals.
Yes.
And so you're right. In the 20s and 30s, Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, Thomas Merton had all been atheists, had all been solid atheists, and they all became profoundly believing Christians. Well, just now I profile in my book the historian Neil Ferguson, but I also write about David Brooks. So Neil Ferguson would be a centre-right person, David Brooks would be a centre-left person. They've both come to actual Christian belief, not to a position that a lot of columnists come to of saying, well, Christianity is good for the culture, but I can't quite believe it. No, they've actually said, I believe. But at the same time, there's this statistical resurgence. It's particularly prominent amongst Generation Z, the Zoomers, and for the first time in history, it's a little more prominent amongst young men than young women. I mean, it's very hard to look at Christian history and not end up being a bit pro-woman because, on the whole, all human beings are called to respond to God, but more women typically respond than men. And, you look at the cross, there was one man standing at the cross, John, and there was a whole group of women. Yeah. The men were missing in action and so forth. But this moment just now is the first time that I'm aware of where a religious Christian movement is attracting slightly more men than women. That's not to say it's not attracting lots of women as well. It's far too early to label it a big historical trend, and we're starting off a very low base. Now, outside of the West, Christianity is booming. The growth of Christianity in China has been astounding. The growth of Christianity in Africa. There are very dynamic Christian movements in Latin America, and Christianity is persecuted in a lot of those places. It's not persecuted in the West. The culture is unsympathetic to us, even hostile, but it's not persecution. But within the West, we're coming from a low base, but there does seem to be this resurgence.
Yeah, and two things can be true at the same time, right? So hedging maybe, but if there is some sort of resurgence, as you say, it's coming from a very low base. So just, watch this space. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Some people would say that the kind of thoroughly secular vision of life hasn't been able to sustain us, and people are starting to look around for something meaningful.
I think that's absolutely true. And young people, oddly enough, get there a bit more quickly than older people. A lot of older people are coming back to the faith too. But so I've had for a long time an analysis that there are the post-Christians, baby boomers who had a tiny little bit of Christianity as kids. They're inoculated against Christianity. Yeah. Then there are the Christians who haven't disappeared, and the last census tells us there may be 45% of Australians, something like that. So that's a minority, but it's a big minority. But then if you're under 40, say, and Zoomers are typically 28 and younger, but if you're under 40, unless you've been to a Christian school or something, you've probably hardly met Christianity. You get nothing in the popular culture, which reinforces Christianity. If there are Christians in popular TV shows, they're normally fruitcakes or corrupt or agents.
The least attractive people to be around.
Absolutely. They're always, sexist and regressive. And it's as if no Christian good work gets done, So Mother Teresa and everybody, they've all been wiped off popular culture. And then, when I was a kid, all the Christmas movies were religious, Miracle on 34th Street, It's a Wonderful Life. For decades now, the Christmas movies have had no trace of religion in them. So someone under 40, the secular education doesn't introduce them to the Old Testament or to St. Paul, and they should know those things just for historical and literary reasons. The popular culture doesn't tell them anything about Christianity, but in a sense, a very awkward metaphor I use is they are medically naive to the virus of Christianity. In other words, they're open to it. You tell them and they hear it as good news. They hear it as it should be, which is good news, rather than the boring old stuff their parents used to do.
This is Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with Greg Sheridan, the foreign editor at the Australian newspaper, about his latest book, How Christians Can Succeed Today. In the second half of the book, Greg focuses on contemporary Christians and their contributions to the world. He calls them the new early Christians, referring to his assessment of our society becoming more pagan and therefore creating an atmosphere with some similarities to what early Christians found themselves wrestling with. Sheridan argues this presents an opportunity for Christianity to show what it offers the world.
I had a lot of reading and debate and thought about how our society is a little neo-pagan, and some Christian thinkers who I respect said, no, don't say that. And C.S. Lewis wrote a famous essay saying pagans were really good guys. Our society is much worse than pagans because pagans at least
had some sort of spiritual
worship the pagan gods and so on. So I spent a chapter trying to work through that. And the pagan gods are so different from the monotheistic God of Judaism or Christianity or Islam or Sikhism or any of the great monotheistic faiths. The pagan gods were within the created order. They didn't really much care about human beings. They didn't really much care about a moral order. They just were forces that you had to propitiate in order to get some patronage from them. And then pagan culture as it was actually lived in Greco-Roman times was very rough. It was very rough. It was red in tooth and claw. It was very violent. It was very misogynist, very hierarchical, and very pessimistic about death. At one point in the book, I go through the whole series of pagan interpretations of death. Some of them thought there might be a half-life afterwards, but basically they thought life was completely ended and tragic for every human being at the end. And there's a lot of that in our current society. And by getting rid of Christianity as the transcendent plausibility structure of our society, we've left people with no transcendent belief. So then people try to invest transcendent belief into politics, which is terrible. That makes politics kind of totalitarian and all or nothing and very extreme and so on. Instead of a reasonable argument about what's the best way to run the post office or something, it becomes a source of human meaning and so forth. Or they invest meaning in self-gratification, and then they find that that's very dull and then ultimately unsatisfying. Then they're seeking ever greater intensity. That's a terrible thing. And that confusion and that emptiness is a tremendous opportunity for Christianity, because they are folks who are suffering a crisis of unbelief. Going back to one of the classics, C.S. Lewis talks about when he converted to belief, and I think he found Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, lying on a table, and he said, that's really unfair of God to do that to me. He said, when you are a conscientious atheist, you have to be very careful of what you read, because that really provoked a crisis in his atheist faith.
Yeah, so he has this, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek but serious kind of reluctance to come towards faith, even as he gets there. I think he describes himself as the most reluctant convert in all of England.
Yeah, that's right.
At one point. Writing about the Greco-Roman world, and I was actually really struck by your point about the pagan world and our current world, where violence as entertainment has become such a thing. You're writing about the Greco-Roman world and you describe it as possessing a gruesome anthropology. What are some of the elements of that? And I'm thinking about, as we shift then to thinking about what Christianity offers in terms of our understanding of what it is to be human, which you identify as a really key part of what it offers.
Yeah, and I think that comes through right from the very earliest part of the Old Testament. People compare the book of Genesis to the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, and they couldn't be less alike. Right. The Genesis is so rational, so calm. God said, let there be light, and there was light. And above all, God created human beings in his own likeness and image. That's not the way the ancient world saw human beings.
No.
And then in the time of Jesus and just after, most human beings were not seen to have human dignity. So even some of the great Greek philosophers said, don't think of slaves as human beings. They are thinking tools. They're like a hammer or a saw or something, but they can just obey your instructions. Slave owners were entitled to do anything they liked with or to their slaves, so the slaves didn't have human dignity. Children didn't have human dignity. Many Roman families left girl babies out to die. I quote a letter from a Roman soldier telling his wife to do just that. If you have a boy, do such and such. If you have a girl, just discard her.
Yeah.
Now, Christianity has a completely different view of what it is to be a human being. But I do think there are real pagan echoes in our culture today. So I was in England doing a stint at a think tank when there was a controversy about a group of schoolgirls in Rochdale who were going around finding completely innocent other schoolgirls who maybe they didn't know even, and just beating the hell out of them on their phone and posting that on the net as the greatest entertainment, and they were just laughing and happy and full of good cheer about just beating some innocent person. Mm. And these were young teenage girls. And I thought, how has this come about? How has this come about? And then, I mean, this may be very censorious and old-fashioned of me, but I think this thing is unlimited fighting and cage fighting and everything. I think it's grotesque. It's hideous. I've come to the view that I would even outlaw boxing, although I'm profound Canterbury Bulldogs rugby league follower. I don't really want my grandsons to play rugby league because of the head injuries.
Yeah.
But this uncaged fighting spectacle, we love to see now blood. This is very much like the crowds in the Colosseum. You know, mum and dad would take the kids along to see people fighting with each other, fighting to the death, or being torn apart by dogs or bulls or whatever it was. Bears was a particularly ferocious, terrible way to die. And the echoes of this. Now, we sometimes slightly sanitise it. Unlimited Fighting pretends they've got medical practitioners. I'm sure they have got medical practitioners, but people still suffer terrible injuries, and the crowd gets enjoyment from watching it. Now, these elements are always in human nature, but one of the roles of culture is to transcend, control, and move beyond the worst elements in culture. Paganism celebrates the worst elements in humanity very often.
And you're arguing that Christianity has a very different vision for each and every person. One of the questions I want to ask you about is the way Christianity grows from this really tiny, ramshackle group of people without power, without status, to this movement that really does eventually overthrow the Roman Empire. That is a remarkable story, isn't it? It's one of the key things you're trying to bring to light.
Yeah, it's one of the most incredible and consequential things that has ever happened in history. Mm-hmm. This is why I think it's so mad that the early Christians are neglected, even if you're just a historian. And there's one great book of history which deals with this, Larry Siddentop's Inventing the Individual, a wonderful, wonderful book, and the book that influenced me more than any other, I think, in my view of history. But there are a couple of things you can identify. So when I started writing this book, a very good friend of mine, Anglican clergyman, said, now don't attribute all their success to their own effort. It was divine intervention. And that's true. I believe that as a believing Christian. But I also think it's fair to analyse it in cultural and human terms, because the fact that they were believing Christians didn't make life easy for them. You know, the old line, faith makes things possible, it doesn't make things easy. They still had to deal with all the awkwardness and difficulty of life. But there are two or three things that you can identify which had massive contribution to the expansion of Christianity. One was the Christian response to plagues. So plagues haunted the ancient world, and I write about two of them, the Cyprian plague and the Gallen plague. And at its worst, 5,000 people a day were dying in Rome. And people generally behaved very badly in the plague because they were terrified. So if one of their relatives got sick, they'd throw him into the street in the hope that the germ wouldn't get to them. Now, even in a plague, most people don't die. Who get the disease, they recover. Now, Christians didn't throw their relatives into the street. They cared for their relatives. And eventually, as far as they could, they cared for their pagan neighbours too. But this meant that the survival rate amongst Christians was much higher, because if someone's very sick and can't fend for themselves, if they've got someone just giving them water and a bit of food and so on, their survival rate shoots up dramatically. So at the end of the plague, the proportion of the population that was Christian was higher than at the beginning of the plague. But, much more important in a way, the reputation of Christians amongst the other folks was also in the stars. It shot up because the other pagan families saw, gee, look at these Christians. Look how they care for one another. Gosh, they even care for us sometimes. Maybe there's something. So that's one very big thing. Another big thing was the way Christians faced persecution, generally with courage and serenity. Now, lots of Christians couldn't bear the persecution and denied Christianity and so on. There is an argument, some historians argue that Christians overstate how much persecution there was, but there are a lot of Greek and Roman sources on how often Christians were persecuted. And cite a survey which shows that over a given period, every Roman account of Christianity, except one, mentions execution of Christians. So you can conclude that persecution was pretty intense at different times. And Christians had a kind of, in ancient Rome, the noblest nobleman still faced despair at death. whereas the humblest Christian slave enjoyed the promise of eternal life. And this sense that they'd conquered death was very powerful, giving hope. This also was very powerful amongst their neighbours. And then the third thing is the thing we've touched on before. Because Christian families had many more daughters than pagan families, they were much happier families. I mean, can you imagine anything more gruesomely horrible than a society which consisted only of blokes? I mean, how ghastly would that be?
Yeah.
So the pro-woman orientation of Christianity, it had obvious demographic consequences. There was a tremendous shortage of women in the Greco-Roman world because there was so much female infanticide. So pagan men would marry Christian women and convert. And then, again, this was part of why Christian families were so much happier than neighbouring families. So that's just a couple of things that contributed to this vast historic movement. But I think those were all factors in the growth of Christianity.
Now, you spend quite a lot of time in the book mentioning that in the ancient world, Christianity was so weird. It was so foreign, so strange to people as they encountered it for the first time. And you're urging contemporary Christians to embrace the weirdness.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
Well, weirdness is an essential key to Christianity. I should have mentioned that as one of the keys to Christian expansion. I mean, Christian belief is a paradox. It's true, so it is in sympathy with the deepest nature of human beings. There is a God-shaped space in the heart of every human being. At the same time, it is a profound mystery. It's always a mixture of something that is utterly obvious and something that is utterly mysterious. God tells us he is good, infinite and everlasting, and yet our minds can't contain that. There's a wonderful line in Augustine's Confessions. He says, our minds can't contain all that we are, therefore we are bigger than our own minds. And the early Christians were very upfront about the weirdness of their beliefs. There's a wonderful passage in Acts of the Apostles where Paul is in the custody of Festus. And Festus says, for goodness sake, Paul, you're a good bloke. I want to let you go. Just stop this talk
nonsense
about physical resurrection, will you? It's pretty damn strange. And we regard it as a bit loopy and a bit offensive. And you can imagine Paul's advisors saying, now, Paul, look, you want to get out of prison, right? Why don't you just
tone it down a bit,
emphasise Christian good works, read the signs of the times, be sensitive to the culture, just emphasise easier doctrines, get to this doctrine later on. So Paul finally gets a chance to speak and he says, I want to proclaim that Christ is the first risen in the body from the dead, and all shall rise from the dead. And Festus says, oh, you must be mad, Paul. Go away. And the early Christians did this all the time. Our beliefs are very weird. We believe that every human being who decays and dies and rots in the ground or gets burnt in that sort of funeral will eventually rise in their body and live for eternity with God in their body. We believe that our church services commemorate the eating of the flesh of Jesus and the drinking of his blood. We believe that all human beings face death, judgment, heaven, hell. We believe in angels. A previous book I had a chapter on angels because angels and miracles are all the way through the Bible. They're there in the start of the Old Testament, the fallen angel tempting Eve. They're there all through the New Testament, the angels announcing to Mary and ministering to Jesus. And then they're there in the final book of the Bible, the Revelation, St. Michael, the archangel fighting the devil and so on. If you don't believe in angels, you've got to wipe out 10% of the Bible or something. So why run away from it? Angels are terrific. We need all the friends we can get. I want to have some angels. Jesus himself talks about angels. He says, don't be mean to these little children because their angels in heaven are constantly talking to God the Father. Now, I wouldn't never criticise another Christian for their belief or their emphasis, but it's as if Christians in the West are they find all these things a bit sort of icky and strange and a bit weird, and let's not bother the culture with that because, angels, for goodness sake, But I'd say the culture embraces every kind of madness and weirdness in the world. Let's present it with the weirdness which is true.
You write at length about someone who you say has had greater influence than any other cultural influencer, and that's the Apostle Paul. Why is he such a huge figure in history and in your book?
Well, I must say, in writing these 3 books, Simon, and spending the happy months and years in research and so forth, and really thrilling my wife with wonderful dinner-time conversation, did you know, darling, the influence that Moses Maimonides had on Thomas Aquinas and
How did that
so
go?
forth? Oh, yeah. Well, it's better than nuclear submarines. She finds it more interesting. But the two characters that I really loved, there were a lot of characters to love. Lydia is fantastic, but the two figures that I had a wonderful feeling about were Paul and Augustine. And I think these are the two great historically significant religious conversions. What do you like about Paul in the New Testament? He is, of course, in an earlier book I said he was Christ's Lenin. You know, Lenin converted Marxism-Leninism into a global movement. I mean, Lenin was a terrible person. Paul was a good person. There's a big difference. But Paul did the same thing for Christianity. He was a genius. He was the first cosmopolitan intellectual. He'd mastered the Jewish world, the Roman world, the Greek world. He spoke good Greek. He understood the Jewish scriptures very deeply. He understood Greek philosophy, all of that. But that's the public Paul. In the New Testament, you get actually a whole lot of the private Paul. And very often he is irascible, bad-tempered. He can be discouraged. He's pretty out there about himself. You know, he doesn't mind telling you when he's discouraged. He's pretty rough with people he disagrees with. I mean, there's a wonderful passage in Galatians where he says, I wish all the people who were misleading you, Galatians, would go and castrate themselves. And you think, across 2,000 years, I hope he was joking. I think that was a bit of humour by Paul. I'm sure he wasn't being literal, but he recounts in one story how he was meek and mild. He went up to see the recognised leaders of the church, James and John and Peter, whom he called Cephas, of course, to check that he was on the right program, and they gave him a tick of approval. But then he says, Cephas, I told him he was completely wrong on this matter of eating.
Told him to his face.
I told him to his face, you are so wrong. And there's a lovely passage somewhere else in Peter where Peter says, you know, Paul, he can be a bit hard to understand, but nonetheless, you got to take him on board. And the final anecdote of Paul, which I love, it comes in the Acts, whereas Paul is being followed around by a woman apparently possessed of a demon who has the power of prophecy. And she keeps saying, Paul is great, Paul is wonderful. And he's very embarrassed about this. And he tells her to go away, and she won't go away. And then it says in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul, in a furious temper, said to the demon, get out of here. Yeah. And this is the only miracle in the New Testament which is performed in a fit of bad temper. You know, Paul was in a bad temper with the devil, so he told him to bugger off. And then, of course, he had to deal with fundraising, and at first everybody had an equal share of everything, but then the question was, what do you do with people who can work but won't work within the Christian community? And this rounded flesh and blood humanity of Paul, who encounters all of the awkward, uncomfortable realities of life. He has the most profound relation with Jesus Christ, and yet he still feels all the awkwardness and difficulty of life. It's just a wonderful, you can't completely sum him up. I think you could study him forever and you'd never exhaust him.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Greg Sheridan, foreign editor at the Australian newspaper, has been my guest today. You can find Greg's writing every week there, and the third in his trilogy of books on Christianity, How Christians Can Succeed Today, is out now. A really good Christmas present. Please send this episode to someone you think might enjoy it. We love it when you do that. Let's get Life and Faith out to more people. Thanks to our producer, Alan Douthwaite, and thanks for listening. Next time.
Colin Buchanan, thrilled to have you on the show. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me, Natasha. Remarkable.
Is it?
This podcast is... People are listening and they're thinking, what's happened to this podcast? What's this buffoon doing on here? Anyway, look, it'll all be over soon enough.